Like this? Okay. I have to play with it. Come on. Okay. You want to play rough? Okay. No. Say hello to my little friend!
Hello everyone and welcome to another video on our own devices. I'm Jean Messier and January is definitely turning into photography month because today I have yet another fascinating early 20th century camera to show you. This is what is typically called a magazine camera, a falling plate camera, a hand camera, or a detective camera. And these were very popular from around the 1890s to the 1920s and served as sort of a missing link between traditional single-shot plate cameras and later flexible film cameras. And to those long-term viewers out there who are now thinking, wait, didn't you already cover this camera? The answer is yes, but that was quite a while ago. And since I recently managed to purchase this camera off of its original owner, I thought it was a high time for a remake. So without further ado, let's dive right in. So with few exceptions, the very earliest cameras could only take one shot at a time. And this was largely because the photographic plates that they used had to be sensitized immediately before taking an exposure and developed immediately afterward. For example, the daguerreotype process, introduced in 1839 by French inventor Louis Daguerre, required the photographer to expose a polished silver-coated copper plate to halogen vapors, typically iodine, chlorine, or bromine, to form a thin, light-sensitive layer of silver halide. Later, in 1851, British inventor Frederick Scott Archer invented the so-called wet plate or collodion process, in which a glass or metal plate was dipped in a mixture of silver nitrate and collodion, which is nitrocellulose dissolved in ether and alcohol. This was immediately then loaded into the camera, exposed, then taken out and developed. And once the development process was finished, then the collodion would dry into a tough plastic layer, trapping the developed image inside. And finally, in 1871, Dr. Richard Maddox invented the so-called dry plate or gelatin process, in which silver nitrate was mixed with gelatin, applied to a glass plate, and allowed to dry. And the dry plate process revolutionized photography, making it far more convenient and flexible, since now as a photographer, you no longer had to haul your bulky darkroom tent and other developing equipment out into the field. You could purchase dry plates ready-made from the factory, expose them, and then carry them around with you in a light, tight box until you could reach your darkroom. Now, as with their wet plate predecessors, the earliest dry plate cameras, again, took one shot at a time, but soon another design of camera called a magazine camera arrived on the scene, which allowed you to carry multiple dry plates inside the camera and take multiple shots in quick succession. And while commercial versions didn't start appearing on the market until the 1890s, the earliest design for a magazine camera had been patented way back in 1856 by British inventor John Benjamin Dancer, who also made significant advances in the field of microphotography. And to learn more about his work and the fascinating photographic trend that it inspired, go check out my previous video on Stanhope viewers. Link, as always, in the description. Right, so let's have a closer look at this particular camera and let me show you how it works. So externally, this looks like any regular box camera like the famous Kodak Brownie, only quite a bit larger. At the front, we have a rapid rectilinear or aplanate lens, which has two controls, an aperture slider at the top, which adjusts an iris diaphragm from f11 to f44, and a focus knob, which rotates a set of three zoom lenses in front of the main lens for taking photos at ranges of 4, 8, and 12 feet and infinity. On the left-hand side of the lens is a knob for controlling our shutter mode, I for instant, and T for timed or long exposure. As I've also covered in previous videos, later cameras almost always used B instead of P, B standing for bulb, i.e. the rubber squeeze bulb often used to operate the shutter when taking long exposures with tripod. Above this, we have a pair of so-called brilliant viewfinders, one for portrait and one for landscape pictures. As I covered in my previous video on pseudo-TLR cameras, these consist simply of two positive lenses with a 45-degree reflex mirror in between, and were almost universal on early 20th century box-style cameras. Down below this, we have our shutter speed control knob, which goes from 1 to 1/100th of a second. The shutter itself, operated by this lever on the right-hand side of the camera, is of the Everset variety, which does not need to be pre-cocked and opens and closes with every press of the lever. And if I unscrew this entire front panel, I can show you how all of these mechanisms work. As you can see, pushing on this lever draws this pair of shutter plates across this track. These plates are each connected to a separate spring-loaded swing arm and connected to each other by this spring latch. When the two reach the far end of the track, this lip lifts up the spring catch and releases the front shutter plate, allowing it to snap across and quickly expose and recover the lens. Now, the speed at which the shutter travels is controlled by rotating this knob, which adjusts the friction on the spring-loaded arm. Now, if I rotate the shutter setting knob, this cam slides the shutter assembly over so that when I depress the shutter lever, the shutter plate can no longer travel the full distance and thus remains open so long as the shutter lever remains depressed. On the bottom and sides, we have standard 1/4-inch threaded tripod sockets for taking portrait and landscape photos, but where this camera really gets interesting is in the back. If we pull up this latch, we can open up the rear door. If we depress this latch and pull down this metal door, we can access our internal magazine. Now, this is designed to hold up to 12 glass plates mounted in these special metal holders. This particular format was known as quarter plate. The standard size of traditional glass photographic plates was 6.5 by 8.5 inches, or 216 by 165 millimeters, so quarter plates were 3.25 by 4.25 inches, or 108 by 83 millimeters. A similar format was postcard size, which measured 3.25 by 5.5 inches, or 83 by 140 millimeters. Now, you'll notice that these plates have numbers stamped into them. This isn't because they're supposed to go into the camera in a particular order. Mechanically, these are all identical. Rather, this is just to help you keep track of the order in which you took your photographs. Now, you insert these into the magazine so that these slots fit over guide rails at the top and the bottom of the magazine. And when you push the plates all the way in, the lead plate eventually stops against this latch, which is located at the focal plane of the lens and is connected to this advanced lever at the top of the camera. And when I close the rear door, this big conical spring applies tension to the whole stack of plates. And so to use this, you would adjust your aperture, shutter speed, and focus. Then press the shutter lever to take a photo as per usual, but then you pull back on the advanced lever, and what this does is release the top of the lead plate, allowing the spring to tip it forward so it lies down horizontally in a storage magazine at the bottom of the camera, hence why this is known as a tipping plate camera. The next plate is then also uncovered and pushed towards the focal plane, ready for the next exposure to be taken. And inside, you can see a series of linear springs that guide the plates down into the storage magazine and prevent them from moving back upwards and blocking the light path if the camera is turned sideways or upside down. Anyway, in this manner, you can keep taking exposures and advancing to the next plate, keeping track of your shots using this exposure counter next to the advance lever. And once all 12 plates were exposed, they would remain safely in this light-tight compartment at the bottom of the camera until you could reach your darkroom and develop them. Now, one flaw with this particular camera is that the shutter mechanism is not in any way linked to the plate advance mechanism, meaning there is nothing to guard against multiple exposures on the same plates. You have to be kind of careful with how you sequence the two mechanisms. Now, while the falling or tipping plate mechanism was by far the most popular for magazine cameras, it wasn't the only one. For example, another flaw of this system is that you can only load and unload the magazine in a darkroom. But there were cameras that held their plates in completely enclosed, light-tight holders that could be opened inside the camera in order to expose them, and these could be loaded and unloaded in daylight. One popular example of this system was the Adlake series of cameras produced by railroad lantern maker Adams and Westlake Company. These cameras were considerably simpler than this one. To advance the next plate, you had to open a hinged cover at the front of the camera, pull out the front exposed plate, and move it to the rear of the plate stack, allowing the next unexposed plate to move forward to the focal plane. You then used a lever to open the hinge shutter on the front plate holder, exposing the plate and allowing the photograph to be taken. Now, given how much lighter and handier these were compared to traditional tripod-mounted plate cameras, these proved quite popular, and their relative unobtrusiveness earned them the nickname of detective cameras. And these are manufactured by a wide variety of companies, including Hugo Svensson & Company Kamerafabriek of Gothenburg, Sweden, the Conley Camera Company of Rochester, Minnesota, and George Houghton & Son of London. This particular camera, however, is a bit of a mystery. See, while the nameplate on the top reads Lafitte Camera of London, Paris, and Switzerland, not any particular city in Switzerland, just Switzerland, I've not been able to dig up any information on this company. However, the overall design of the camera is nearly identical to one of the most popular models of magazine cameras, the Midg series produced by William Butcher and Sons of London. Now, Butcher and Sons was founded in 1889 by one William Butcher, who was a registered pharmacist and started out wholesaling homeopathic medical supplies and magic lanterns. And in 1889, he and his sons entered the photography market, their business being headquartered at Camera House on Farringdon Avenue in London. While they did produce a few of their own products, they mostly imported cameras and other equipment from German companies such as Leica and Hüttich and resold them under their own brand names, including Cameo, Climax, Carbine, Pressman, and National. And in 1900, they introduced the first of the Midg series of falling plate magazine cameras. And by the way, that's spelled M-I-D-G and was short for midget, not a reference to the flying insect. Why they didn't just call it the midget, I have no idea. Likely another camera company already had the rights to that name. Anyway, between 1900 and 1910, Butcher and Sons produced 9 different versions of the Midg camera. And while sources differ wildly over what the differences between them were, based on a couple of period Butcher and Sons catalogs I was able to find, these versions were the number 0, which was nearly identical to the Lafitte camera we've just looked at, and originally retailed for 21 shillings for the quarter plate and 35 shillings for the postcard version, or around 126 and 210 pounds today. The number 00, which had a Beck rapid rectilinear lens and retailed for 25 shillings or around 150 pounds today. The number 1A, which was similar to the number 00 but had a rack and pinion focusing lens instead of swing-in zoom lenses and a hinged front panel to allow access to the lens for cleaning. It retailed for 31 shillings, around 186 pounds today. The number 1, which was similar to the number 1A but had a lever-focused Beck symmetrical lens and an automatic rather than an ever-set shutter. It retailed for 42 shillings for the quarter plate and 50 shillings for the postcard version, or around 252 and 300 pounds today. The number 2, which had an Aldus Uno and a stigmat lens and an automatic shutter. It retailed for 45 shillings for the quarter plate version and 57 shillings and 6 pence for the postcard version, or around 270 and 345 pounds today. The number 3, which was similar to the number 2 but had a rack and pinion focused lens. Unlike previous models, the number 4 did not have 2 brilliant viewfinders. You had to buy either a landscape or a portrait version. Optional Beck and Goetz lenses were also available. It retailed for 57 shillings and 6 pence for the quarter plate version and 70 shillings for the postcard version, or around 345 and 420 pounds today. The number 4, which had a higher quality external and internal finish, a folding bed, and an extending bellows-mounted lens, and retailed for 84 shillings or 504 pounds today. The Midg Panoramic, which had a wide-angle lens and accommodated higher aspect ratio 6.5 by 2 3/8 inch or 165 by 60 millimeter plates for taking panoramic shots. It retailed for 30 shillings, around 180 pounds today. And finally, the Acto Midg, which included a built-in light meter to help correctly set the aperture and shutter speed. It retailed for 44 shillings, or around 264 pounds today. Now, as far as I've been able to determine, the number 1 came first in 1900, and it was followed in 1902 by the simpler and cheaper number 0 and 00, these being named retroactively in order to create a linear progression of price points. Now, in 1914, the outbreak of the First World War prevented Butcher and Sons from importing more cameras from Germany, and so in 1915, they joined forces with rival firm Houghton in order to share the latter's manufacturing facilities, though both companies' product lines remained distinct until 1926, when they finally merged to form Ensign Limited, a prominent British photography brand that ceased operations in 1961. Anyway, back to our mystery camera here. Like I said, this is nearly identical in design to the Midg series of cameras, especially the Midg number 0, except for a couple of minor cosmetic differences. And since Butcher and Sons largely imported all of their cameras from companies on the continent, it is likely that Lafitte Camera was one of those companies. Alternatively, Lafitte Camera could have been a company like Butcher and Sons that imported, rebadged, and resold cameras from other companies. As always, if any of you know any more about this particular company, please let me know. Now, before we end the video, one other fun fact to note about this camera is its involvement in something called the Cottingley Fairies hoax. See, in 1917, 16-year-old Elsie Wright and 9-year-old Frances Griffiths used a Midg number 1 camera to take pictures of what they claimed were real fairies near Cottingley Beck in West Yorkshire. Now, these photos immediately caught the attention of none other than Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, and he immediately pronounced them to be incontrovertible proof of the existence of fairies, and later wrote an entire book on the subject. Now, of course, it was later revealed that these photos were fake, big surprise. The girls had just cut out images of fairies from picture books and propped them up with hat pins. If you want to learn more about this bizarre incident and how somebody like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle could have been so easily taken in, please check out my video on the subject that I wrote over on Today I Found Out, link in the description. And that, dear viewers, is a brief overview of magazine cameras, a now largely forgotten step in the evolution of consumer photography. And while this was something of a transitionary technology, they did remain popular for quite some time, not leaving the market until the 1920s, well after flexible film photography had been well established. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time in another video or look at yet more cameras and other subjects, other fascinating devices just like this. Until then, I'm Jean Messier from Our Own Devices. Have a great day.